Coming up, the Brooklyn Nets are riding high, winning games left, right, and center. And yet, there is some buzz and rumor around a disgruntled player inside of the conference that could be a key addition to help put this team over the championship contender hump. We break down if John Collins is the missing piece for the Brooklyn Nets.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator of DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings. From DraftKings to FanDuel, he's got you covered. I'm Adam Marmbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast with my boy, Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. And Doug, we got a few off days here before the Brooklyn Nets take the court again. And there are rumors, as you are going to highlight, that suggest John Collins could be available and out there for teams to pursue. And the rumblings are maybe the Brooklyn Nets are the good landing spot, the right landing spot, and an achievable target for the Nets to improve this team.
Yeah, so it came out a couple days ago, which has been floated around by multiple sources at this point. Shams Charania from The Athletic, and then was following up in Ian Begley from SNY story, that the Nets had basically poked around with the Hawks about the availability of John Collins. And there's a few moving pieces here, and they were not the only team that was interested. And I'm aggregating some of this from our friends over at Nets Daily. But it was other teams like Utah and Washington and Dallas had expressed interest in a guy like Collins. And it was it was interesting to get this, like, specifically from the Nets, because, well, for a lot of reasons that we'll discuss. One, like, the Nets fans and Nets brass probably have long wanted to stretch big here in the door. Collins' name has been bandied about often as maybe being an odd piece out in terms of Atlanta, both based on his usage and his contract, and maybe just his overall feeling about staying with Atlanta. And there are a group of teams that could probably use a guy like this coming in the door to help, with a little bit of size and a little bit of, 3-point shooting and all this stuff. So it's not surprising that the Nets were in on the conversations here. And, admittedly, that did not seem like it got all that far, right? Like, this is just probably a call in, but it does really speak to sort of like where the league is going, where the Nets probably feel like they need to upgrade at some point if they're going, both short-term and long-term with the roster. And Collins is a name that obviously has been in and around these discussions for a long time. There's a small group of guys whose names consistently come up when it comes to trades, when it comes to big men. Collins is one of them. Obviously, Miles Turner is another one. And there's a few other guys. It's for a reason. These guys have value, and we can talk about whether or not we think this is the right move for the Nets.
Yeah, and it's funny, too, in some ways, because John Collins, going back to last season, I talked about him mostly because he's under contract for he's 3 years after this season. It's only in the 20-ish plus million range per year. So, like, the number isn't terrible if you're thinking about what is it going to cost you to keep this player around. It's nice to have a guy under control. If you're the Nets or any team that says we can bring him in to help bolster us now, and maybe it also provides us with an asset down the road. But I found it interesting that when Atlanta went out and got DeJounte Murray and you pair him with Trae Young, like, I just always thought at some point maybe, because Indiana and Miles Turner, well, that team was, at least that we think they're still trying to tank, and they'll get there eventually.
But it's like, about that, yeah.
I know, and now all of a sudden they're having a good season. But in theory, it was, well, Miles Turner is a really good player on a team that's going in another direction, right? Whereas Atlanta, who's trying to win and wants to be a contender now, I always thought, well, maybe John Collins will just end up rounding back into this team and being a part of it. But that hasn't changed at all. And if anything, it seems like it's only getting progressively worse. And that's predicated on what his skill set is, how it functions for Atlanta, and then maybe also what he thinks his function should be, right? Where he thinks his skill set is best used, and that it's not being valued in Atlanta currently.
Yeah, so there are a lot of moving parts here with Collins for sure that need to like be talked about when you think about bringing a guy like him in through the door. For starters, he is hurt right now. He's dealing with an ankle sprain. He's been out a couple of games. It's not a long-term issue, so he is supposed to be back. Atlanta's just got crazy issues with injuries basically across the board. Like Trey just sat out, DeJounte Murray's out, Collins is out. So they've dealt with a bunch of different stuff. So that's the one thing. The other thing with Collins, you mentioned the contract. He is contracted out through 25, 26. And that year, he has a $27-ish million player option. I would almost guarantee he turns that down, just kind of like based on his age and based on where contracts will likely be at that point. So my guess is this contract is really only for this season and then the two after, at around $27 million a year by the end of it, just because that's a guess, right? Like who knows what happens with players, but just based on the way these things are going, new TV deals coming in, the money getting bigger, a guy like Collins is just not who will at that point presumably be an established NBA player for a while. There's almost guaranteed that money does not see the 27 million player option that he wants to sign an extension, whether it be with Atlanta or whoever he gets traded to. So those are just a couple of just the details in and around Collins. I agree with you about where his name gets thrown into this mix, because I get it. There's a shortage of players of his size and skill, no matter what you think of him, that are like available in the NBA. That's problem number one. This is why the Nets fans are always pining for guys like this. Believe me, they're not the only team. Every team wants guys with length that can presumably shoot threes if called upon, defend multiple positions, like up to the 5 and the 4 somewhat effectively, right? Even if he's not known as a defender. There's a reason the same kind of list of names gets thrown out there, is because there's not a lot of these guys. It's very difficult to go find this just on the open market, and definitely not on the scrap heap. So even if you're not a huge Collins stan, which I don't think there's tons of, it's understandable, even if you're lower on him, why guys like this would garner a lot of attention among a lot of different groups of people, right? Or groups of teams, just because it's just hard to recreate this guy in a lab. Like you can't really do it. Does that make sense? Because I want to have some stats I want to throw out about Collins, but just like starting there on it, I think it's interesting to start there, because even if you're not a huge Collins believer, I think you do at least need to recognize that a guy like him, there just aren't a lot of him.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and that alone, I think, has value. Like, even if you think he's not a crazy great player,
right,
it just is hard to find 6'9" guys with a wingspan that can shoot threes and do some other things on the court, even if like some of the other things are somewhat of negatives.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And this is what it was going back to last year. I remember saying it's not just, he's not this unicorn player, but there's a scarcity of talented players that are available on the trade market. And then you combine it with, I always think about it through the prism of when you have Kevin Durant, now Ben Simmons, Kyrie Irving, you think about how does this guy, as we'll talk about, the fit, right? How can his game be better on my team versus where he currently sits right now in the way that he's being utilized? And that's where, like, I don't know. It's funny because, and you're going to talk about a little bit of stats here. He's having a bad 3-point shooting season this year, but it's funny to think about if we over elevate a player when they're disgruntled, when they don't like their role, you start to dream on, oh, so that means though they'll be better somewhere. It'll be so much different, so much more dynamic. And there's always this margin of, well, is it role in the current team, or is that role predicated on skill set, right? So there's a little bit of players being prideful or thinking that they can take that next step. We just talked about Edmund Sumner and his comment after the Pacers game and that win, right? We're all NBA players. We can all do it, but it's about serving your role. When you talk about a John Collins and his skill set and saying, I don't like my role here, you do have to at least try to apply it and say, can his role be better and more suited if we was on our team as opposed to theirs?
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting question, especially when you compare the Hawks and the Nets, who in some ways might not be all that different, and what the role would look like if you were to have Collins come in through the door. Going to talk about that as well as some stats around John Collins that are probably pretty relevant to know about especially if you're among the group that wants to trade for him. First, we're going to tell you about our friends over at Turo. Turo is the world's largest car sharing marketplace. With Turo, you can book any car you want whenever you want it from a community of local hosts. You can browse a huge selection of vehicles for just about any occasion or budget. Sometimes you don't think about cars for occasions, but that you really should get that into your mind. Maybe you need an SUV or a minivan for a family road trip. Maybe you got a special event. You want to come up there looking classy. You grab the classic or luxury car. Maybe you just need something affordable. If you want to get from point A to point B, or you want to test out a car like an electric vehicle, see if it's right for you, Turo has all of those options. Many hosts are even going to deliver the car right to your doorstep. Every trip is backed by liability insurance. Terms, conditions, and exclusions apply. Forget boring car rentals and find your drive at Turo.com.
Okay, so there's where he is, what the contract is, and the fact that he should be available for the Brooklyn Nets to go and pursue if they want to. What are the stats that back up and what the question about whether or not they can get better as he moves over to a team like Brooklyn?
Okay, so I'm not sure that a lot of this is going to back it up. He's really struggling this season. He's shooting just 22% from three on more than 3 attempts per game. A lot of those are of the corner three variety, which is an even more sort of damning number because it's going to be easier, theoretically, if that's what you're going to be shooting, to hit those than it is going to be to hit in rhythm threes or, the kind of threes that Kyrie takes. Or I'm not comparing them. I'm just saying that not all 3-pointers are built the same. There's the PJ Tucker, I'm standing in the corner all by myself threes. And then there's the Seth Curry, I'm off my 6th screen and I'm jacking one up. Right. So and then everything else in between, right? Collins's threes are more toward the former variety than the latter. He's really, really struggling. There are some stats too that are going to back up. Like if you're worried about Collins as a defender, or specifically if you're worried about Nets, the offense is okay-ish and the defense is what needs help. But, we can land in a couple different places here with what you think the Nets need. Collins does not bring a lot defensively. If you look at the Hawks over the last couple of seasons, with Collins on, I'm going to delineate these two things, with Collins on the court and Capella off the court, meaning Collins is one of the main functional bigs. And that's the way they're kind of running with their team, because they don't, outside of Okongwu, they haven't really run with a lot of bigs. And obviously brought in Capella a couple of seasons ago. The numbers are pretty bad. They all have a negative net rating with Collins on and Capella off. And that's over 17, over almost 1,800 minutes. So it's a negative net rating with him on the court. When it's him and Capella, it's actually really good. In your mind, you're putting those two guys, and Trae Young's on the court for that too. And that's that's going to be their best lineup. Those lineups are good. So it's one of these things where Collins, who is probably upset with his role on the team, might miss the forest for the trees that the team is just better. Excuse me, gets a little getting choked up about John Collins here.
Around these things. Yeah.
I get a little frog in my throat when I talk, stretch bigs. Where the role might be something that he doesn't like, the numbers support that is probably the better role for the team when he's in that position, right? He's playing the 4 and he's probably not shooting. The usage rate is super low, 11% or something like that. So he's just really not getting a lot of shots up. All those numbers tick up a little bit with Capella off the court. But all this to be said is it might be that his role based on some of these numbers is just correct right now. Right. But either Atlanta doesn't see it or he doesn't see it, or there's just some kind of, mixed messages about where they are. But when you hear those numbers specifically about when he's the main big, and just what he actually does on the court, or maybe the only things he does well, and then you have the 3-point shooting, is that a guy you actually want to walk in the door here?
Yeah, it's funny too, because first of all, when he's the functioning big, if that's the negative side of his stat lines, and he doesn't want to be doing the role where he's more successful with Atlanta, that's a concern. Because if you're bringing him into Brooklyn, we talk about fit, I'm thinking about it. Well, Nicholas Claxton's our 5.
Right.
You come in at the 4. You make it functional for KD. That gets to move down. All the matchups get better, and it looks really good. That's the one version of the lineup. You're sweet. But if John Collins doesn't like that role, well, then it becomes very non-functional and it becomes a moot point to pursue him, because that's exactly where I'm putting him if he comes over to the Nets. I'm not saying, well, you come in and you play at the 5 and now Claxton's role gets changed or diminished in some way, or we start to make these adjustments. The only version of it where he could play at the 5, regardless, just put aside the numbers for a second, is if you're talking about wanting, like, you want Ben Simmons to play down at the point forward role, okay, and that functions, and maybe you play offensive, defensive as far as where those matchups go, so that you put Ben Simmons on the bigs. You can work that, but it still comes down to, if you want to be the functional big, then you functionally cannot be a part of the Brooklyn Nets.
Well, so this is right. This was the next place I was going, is like, if you're not happy with your fit in your current team for whatever reason, and maybe that's a little conjecture, right? Like maybe it's not, maybe there's more than meets the eye here. Like there's obviously been problems that are going on with the Hawks. We just saw Trae Young sit out a game because of a disagreement with the coach. They've maybe underperformed last year. Like there's other issues.
And Collins is seemingly on that team, for whatever his talent is, whatever his skill level is, he seemingly has always been left down on the totem pole of like valuable players on the roster, right? There's always somebody else getting put ahead of him, groups of players getting put ahead of him. So there could just be that part of like, I just don't want to be a team where I feel like I've been undervalued literally the entire time I've been here.
And here's the other thing, having that guy come in through the door, like, I know they're different teams, but really on a high level, how different are the Nets here? Like, you already mentioned that they already have Claxton. We'll talk about Claxton later in the week, because we went off a little bit on a YouTube bonus episode, maybe even get to the end of this episode, about Claxton and just the underappreciation among Nets folks when it comes to Claxton. But you're already not going to supplant a guy like Claxton. And when it comes to usage, that's not going to get higher coming into this Nets team. You play on the team, you'd be playing on a team with two of the highest usage guys in the league, in Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. So it's not like there's going to be this overabundance of shots for a guy like Collins in this offense. So while the Nets run obviously a very different system than a pick and roll heavy Hawks team, in the end, when it comes out in the wash, I mean, how much different was it really going to look with a guy like Collins here when it comes to stat padding and things like that, or like, getting yours? And again, that's putting words in his mouth. Like, I'm not saying that that's what he's asked for. I'm just saying, if you don't like the role, you don't like the way it's going, I don't see that role being any different with the Nets, with the one exception being like, maybe you just think the team is going to be better. Like, that is another thing too. Like, it's a lot easier sometimes to be on a team that you just think has higher ceiling. You can diminish a role for a team with a higher ceiling. It's a little hard to diminish your role for a team with a lower ceiling, because you're like, hey, what are we doing here? Like, right. if we're not going to win the championship and I'm not taking any shots, then like literally what's happening? Now, if we have championship aspirations, then I can forego some of those other things because of just like, there's another goal at hand. And so there's a lot of moving parts. I guess my overall point was to agree with you to start, to say, I agree with you. Like, if you're paired with Claxton, your role is the same. Right. And essentially, and it might be that they can't have him not be paired with a guy like Claxton because of where like what his overall skill set. So it just ends up being this very weird in between for a guy like him.
So before we talk about coming up, the price point, what is it going to cost to get him and how that impact the Brooklyn Nets roster? I will just say, because we're not dragging him what the skill set is. A couple of things that I'll highlight is, obviously he's been a consistent. He averages 8 rebounds for his career, 7.5 plus over the last 3 seasons. So obviously he provides that for you. He's playing 30 minutes a night in most, in the last 3 seasons as well. So there's a functionality there. I'll throw into it. It may seem frivolous, but he also shoots almost 80% from the line. He's up at 84% this season from the line. That's not the worst thing to have. And this isn't, by the way, that's not what a $25 to $30 million player, the first thing he goes, was a good free throw shooter. But we know the Brooklyn Nets do have guys like Claxton, like Ben Simmons, that are not great free throw shooters. I mean, heck, even Joe Harris is not as good of a free throw shooter as you would think he would be, being one of the best 3-point shooters. So, there are these little functionalities to it. Again, more size, more length. I can see a role for him. It's just whether or not he's ready to agree to that role and be excited about it. And I'll throw in, just to tie it off, that you mentioned, listen, it's this year and 2 more seasons. If he wants to put his best foot forward and be able to opt out and go pursue another contract, you can also just be looking at the landscape, Brooklyn or any team, and saying, where do I get to go, show that my numbers can be better than what they've been in Atlanta, and put myself in a spot to make more money, right? Like, I mean, all these things are a big factor in it, including competing for a championship, which I think if you're John Collins and you're looking at Atlanta and you're looking at Brooklyn, at least on paper, you'd say, hey, I go join Brooklyn. I think that I'm helping push us over that hump. We'll talk about what it would cost to acquire John Collins coming up here in a second.
Yeah, look, I'm not just to put a pin on that. Like, I'm not I haven't been dragging the guy. I'm just trying to compare the situations, and also look, and just to reiterate too, he doesn't get to choose the trade. He's never asked for. I don't. Before we know, there's been like formal trade requests from him, and he doesn't really get he signed the contract. At this point, he probably doesn't get to choose his landing spot, and he's not in the tier of guys that can do that either. Yeah. So I just wanted, probably just be a little more clear about that. All right. Before we get into what's the Nets could think about, going into the trade deadline, a few months away with, and for a guy like Collins or someone else, going to tell you about our friends over at betonline.net, your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. BetOnline's got you covered for all of your betting and wagering action, latest odds, trends for every league out there. Pro football, college bowl season coming up here, World Cup still storming along, basketball obviously every single night. They've got it all over at betonline.net. It's the fastest and easiest way to get all of your betting info. Head on over to BetOnline right now. You use the mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts.
And where we start to wrap up the conversation on should the Brooklyn Nets pursue a trade for John Collins is what would it cost to get him? Because John Collins currently, if you go over on wherever you want, whatever machine you want to function inside of, if you go over and take a look at what John Collins is with that $23+ million contract, and you take a look at the Brooklyn Nets roster. So the first and obvious thing would be is the guy that always gets mentioned inside of any of these trade discussions because of the money that he occupies. That's Joe Harris. And the Atlanta Hawks would probably be happy to put another perimeter shooter onto their roster. So the phase one is, would you trade Joe Harris for John Collins? Like, in a quick, simple yes or no there, Doug.
Myself on mute as I thought about the Joe Harris.
Doug is thinking about it.
I would not do that. No. My quick answer here, and by the way, I would have said this, I think, even before Harris started like coming back to life shooting. It was a little harder because it was like hard to know if it was the injury piece, but we've always been of the mind that Harris is kind of like the piece you need on this team. So I would just default no. And I would definitely default no now that we've seen like he's kind of rounding back into shape. But yes, I would not do it for Harris. So I think I know where you're going next year.
So on top of which, by the way, just Harris for Collins straight up from a number standpoint wouldn't work. The Nets would have to give up a little bit more in order to get across that threshold and make the money work. So you're going to have to throw somebody else in. And that's where you wonder if the Atlanta Hawks are trying to value him at a high leverage spot. You're almost saying, well, the Joe Harris money makes it match. We also want a Cam Thomas, a guy that we think we can develop in the background, only $2.1 million on the books. But more importantly, the Atlanta Hawks would probably say, you know who we'd really like? You got a little bit of a youngster there playing, and that'd be Nicholas Claxton. It's like, we want Claxton. You give us Claxton, and by the way, other things to make the money work. So we want Joe Harris and Nicholas Claxton for John Collins. At which point, like, I'm already on the same page with you about, like, I've always liked Joe Harris. We love how he functions. We love what his role is on this team. You start talking Nicholas Claxton, if I'm Sean Marks, I'm like laughing my way out of that room.
Yeah, no chance. Like, no chance. I don't think you can't even consider it with the way Claxton's playing. Like, again, I think we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive in Claxton this week, but very simply, the on-off numbers are just so in his favor. Like, it's just not, I think I wouldn't do Claxton for Collins straight up. Like, right. Like, and that's taking money aside. I don't think I would even do that. I just think by what you get from Claxton, I know what you get from Collins theoretically. I think even if you wash money out of the thing here, I'm not positive that if you just swap those two guys, because like the NBA didn't have the money trade piece that needs to work out within the salaries. I don't even know if I would do 1-for-1 on that trade just because of what Claxton brings to the team and what I guess only in theory Collins does. Like, you know what I mean? Would you even do that? Would you even do that 1-for-1?
Well, here's what the problem is, right? Because I mean, we'll go a little bit deeper on. We did this on the post podcast YouTube stream where we got into the Nicholas Claxton conversation, and Doug very clearly outlined why Nicholas Claxton remains undervalued, and maybe by most Brooklyn Nets fans. But the 1-to-1 of, if we're talking about improving this team for championship contention, taking away the defensive skill set of Nicholas Claxton and bringing in whatever the skill set is of of Collins. Boy, I'm gonna have a hard time getting these guys' names out correctly. You diminish your defensive value on this team, and that's so critical to their success to me. Claxton and Ben Simmons are the defensive anchors to what they're going to accomplish. There's nobody else functionally that's going to replace that for John Collins if you take Claxton out of that rotation for Brooklyn. So I don't know if on the back end of a trade like that this season, I wouldn't say that they improve their title odds. You'd have to go and make a supplemental move off of that as well. So no, I mean, you're probably right. And by the way, like I've always been a pro. I get behind the young players, the young guys. I think maybe the only angle that you'd be taking on this is, again, back to long-term, what do we think? John Collins under contract for 2 more seasons after this. You assume the Brooklyn Nets put a stopgap salary on Nicholas Claxton so they can continue to see his development and then come back to the table again, right? Just a 2-year deal. Joe Harris, conversely, just when we talk about the fact that he has just 2 years remaining, 1 year after this season. So you know that his time is coming to an end in that regard. You're probably not going to re-up him. I wouldn't think. You'd go on to, replace his functionality depending on what the numbers look like. So there's just so many factors inside of it, but it's weird because I'm a fan of John Collins. I'm just not a fan of what it would take for the Brooklyn Nets to get him. It's probably.
I agree with you. I think that's like mostly it, right? It's like, it's not negging on John Collins here. It's just like, it's being realistic about where the trade market is and right now. And like, if you could just add John Collins to your team right now, would the Nets be better? Yes, of course. They would just be a better team. If you kicked off Day'Ron Sharpe and added John Collins, would the Nets be better? Of course. It's like, it's silly to even bring it up that way, but it's not. These things never function in vacuums like that, right? They never function in just this, I give up nothing and I get something. As much as people want that to be the case with every fake trade they ever made up, and that is a time-honored tradition when trading players is my team will give up nothing. I will get all
everything.
Of it. I'll get all of it.
Yeah.
I'll get all of it, and we'll be better. And like, it's just that easy. It's just not. So it's like, this is why, was the episode all about John Collins? Yeah, of course. But in at a higher level, this is like the kind of exercise you need to walk through every time you want to make a move like this. If you're a fan, if you love the Nets, if you think about the Nets a lot, you think about their roster and you do all this stuff, and this is, you fiddle around the trade machine, you think about lineups and all these different things you do as fans, you have to think, all right, 1, what am I giving up? 2, what will actually happen? Like, what will actually happen when the player is in the door? Whose minutes is that player taking? Okay, we want to add player X. Okay, great. When you add player X's 25 minutes or more or less, you have to take away someone else's minutes. Whose are those going to be? I always challenge people when you want to make these trades, go and just make a little spreadsheet, make it so it adds up to 240 minutes, put the team in there, and go and write down how many minutes each player is going to play, and see, because you'll see, you can't have 330 minutes for all your favorite players to play all the minutes in the game. It's only 240. Right. And whenever you make a move for your team, you have to think about, okay, well, if he plays, someone else can't play. And these guys can't play together. So, XYZ can't play together. So now those minutes have to come out. It's an exercise that I think is really worth fans to go through, even on a small level, because you'll end up seeing it's just not so easy to just add a player and it all gets better. 1, you're giving someone up, maybe multiple people up. 2, you got to figure out how that all fits. It's just not. I think sometimes people just want to take in their favorite player and call it a day, and it's just never that easy.
No, listen, hey, the guy comes available for free on the open market. You can go ahead and pursue that any way that you want.
Even if he came up for free on the open market,
you still have to do the equation, right? So
you still have to walk
30 to 35 minutes for John Collins, who doesn't play. And specifically when it comes to the Brooklyn Nets, and I know we'll get out the door here, but specifically when it comes to them, when you think about the things you value the most, or what we value the most around Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving and Ben Simmons, the perimeter shooting, right? That supporting cast. It's just when you think about that, there's specific guys. You look at their roster, you'd go, okay, reduce his minutes by 5, reduce his minutes by 7. What does that look like over the course of a 48-minute game and over the course of a season and pursuing a championship or deep playoff runs? It is important because, again, I like John Collins a lot as a player. It's just hard for me now with the way Claxton has come on and the certain pieces on this roster to say, oh yeah, take away something from someone else that I really like the way they fit on this team. And there's going to be more opportunities to talk about some other scenarios here as we prepare ourselves for the trade season and speculation to kind of ramp up, and with a couple more off days before Brooklyn takes the court again.
Yeah, look, we're still in the middle of a nice little win streak here. Eight of the last nine of the last 10, something like that for the Nets. It's been a nice run here, not trying to change the team by any means, more responding to just like, this is news that's come out, and the people have kicked the tires on certain players. We're probably going to hear more about this especially as the Nets look like they're improving. They're going to, especially if they become probably buyers, not sellers, as it goes forward with the way the team is playing. This is just going to be something that comes up more and more. All right, make sure you subscribe to YouTube. I'm pretty sure we're going to get to 4,000 subscribers over on YouTube before the new year. That has been the goal. Make sure, be part of that goal. It's super easy and it's all free, and it really helps us. All you got to do is click one button, click the subscribe button, Locked On Nets YouTube. Become a subscriber. You'll know when we're going, and set the alerts too, because then you'll know when we're going live after games, like the one after Indiana last week, and where everyone was just juiced up. Last night after the Wiz, tons of people in here have hit subscribe for Locked On Nets YouTube.
Always know if the juice is worth the squeeze. You know what that means? It means you don't steal my girl unless you're ready to accept the consequences. Now that's Kelly, as performed by Timothy Oliphant from The Girl Next Door.
One of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.